Nearly 3 decades after the zombie catastrophe reshaped the world, a boy named Spike finds himself dragged into a brutal initiation by a roaming gang of teenagers. Surrounded by them in the ruins of civilization, he is forced into a fight while the group watches eagerly. Their leader, Jimmy, observes the situation with cruel entertainment written across his face. Terrified and unsure what to do, Spike stands frozen as Jimmy theatrically calls upon his so-called father, Satan, whom he jokingly refers to as Old Nick, claiming they should witness whether the newcomer deserves a place among them. Someone tosses Spike a knife, but before he can even react, another boy knocks it from his hands, turning the moment into a joke for the crowd. Laughter spreads through the group. Only one member, a girl named Kelly, seems uncomfortable with what's happening. The bully keeps humiliating Spike, pushing him further while the others cheer. Suddenly, in a desperate burst of instinct, Spike yanks the boy's pants down and drives the knife into him. The crowd erupts with laughter at first, thinking it's harmless chaos, but the mood quickly shifts. The blade has severed a major artery, and when it's pulled free, blood pours uncontrollably. The wounded boy collapses as life drains from him. No one steps forward to help, they simply watch as he slowly dies on the ground. Jimmy calmly walks up to Spike afterward, almost impressed. With a grin, he announces that from this moment forward, the boy's name is Jimmy as well, explaining that everyone in their group shares the same name. As a final symbol of acceptance, Spike is handed the dead boy's wig. Soon after, the gang resumes their journey across the desolate wasteland, casually eliminating a wandering zombie along the way. Elsewhere, deep within dense jungle terrain, a hunter stalking a deer suddenly becomes prey himself when a swarm of infected charges toward him. Among them moves something different, an alpha, stronger and noticeably more intelligent than the rest. The creature catches the fleeing man and violently tears his head from his body. Not long after, a man named Dr. Ian carefully transports a corpse from an abandoned train toward a strange temple he has built for himself. While walking, he senses movement behind him. The alpha stands there, watching. Ian immediately prepares a dart blower as the creature rushes forward, only stopping when it notices the weapon. Slowly, Ian lowers the blower, almost inviting the alpha closer before finally firing a tranquilizing dart that weakens it. Approaching cautiously, Ian tends to the creature's injuries, removing arrows left behind by hunters. Speaking calmly the entire time, he treats it less like a monster and more like a patient. During this encounter, he gives the alpha a name, Samson. Returning to his temple, Ian resumes his peculiar routine. He prepares a memorial for the body he recovered, carefully cleaning the skull before placing it among others arranged with reverence. Afterwards, he retreats into his living space, plays music from another era, and sits quietly, absorbed in memories while studying old photographs from the world that once existed. The following morning, Ian arms himself again with the dart blower and goes looking for Samson. This time, the alpha appears unusually calm. Ian gently calls him closer until the creature stops only a short distance away. Another dart is fired, and Ian sits beside the subdued alpha, speaking softly. He wonders aloud whether Samson understands anything he says, perhaps not the words, but the intention behind them. Ian insists he means no harm and even hopes Samson might someday respond. As Ian continues talking, Samson remains still beside him. Eventually, Ian lies down nearby and drifts into sleep. When he awakens, Samson has vanished, and Ian feels relieved that the creature chose not to attack him. The next day brings a surprise. Samson returns, leaving behind the severed head of a deer as an offering. Ian greets him warmly, waving before once again sitting nearby to converse while rain falls through the jungle canopy. Later, in a strangely peaceful moment, Ian even dances while Samson watches beside him. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the jungle, 3 survivors search desperately for food supplies. They suddenly spot an infected woman nearby. The older man accompanying them warns that if she notices them, her scream will summon others. He moves in to quietly eliminate her, but before he succeeds, the zombie shrieks anyway. Panic erupts. The pregnant woman flees alongside another man as more infected converge on their position. The older man attempts to escape as well, but quickly becomes surrounded. Fighting desperately, he is overwhelmed when blood splashes into his eyes. Within moments, the infection takes hold, and he turns into one of them. The surviving couple manages to reach their settlement and rush through the protective gate just in time. Inside their hut, an elderly resident informs them that visitors have arrived. To their horror, Jimmy and his gang sit comfortably at their table, already helping themselves to food while the frightened family serves them. Jimmy casually orders one of the girls, Jimmia, to entertain everyone. She begins dancing while tension fills the room. The woman of the house demands to know why they are there. Jimmy responds mockingly, claiming they are simply enjoying the family's hospitality, and asks whether they are unwelcome. Her answer is firm and direct. Yes, they are. Jimmy slams his hand onto the table, laughing off the hostility. When she asks again if they plan to leave, he calmly replies that they will, but only after killing everyone present. Suddenly, a desperate family member throws boiling water at the intruders. Chaos breaks out, yet the attackers quickly overpower them. The family is beaten and restrained, though the woman manages to escape during the struggle. The gang drags the captured survivors away while Kelly, separated from the others and searching for the pregnant woman, wanders alone through the wilderness. At the same time, Dr. Ian spends another peaceful day following his unusual routine. From a distance, Kelly spots something unbelievable. Ian joyfully dancing in the open while the alpha, Samson, stands beside him calmly. The sight leaves her completely stunned, unsure whether what she's witnessing is real. Inside an abandoned farmhouse, Jimmy stands before his followers delivering another one of his unsettling sermons. He speaks passionately about Old Nick and his version of how the world came to ruin. According to him, Old Nick unleashed demons across the earth and chose a favored son, himself, to guide humanity and rule over what remains of civilization. Nearby, a family of 4 sits bound tightly to chairs, their mouths gagged to silence their pleas. Jimmy continues explaining that Old Nick also commanded him to perform acts of generosity for the broken world. These acts, he claims, come in the form of sacrifices. With a satisfied smile, he announces that tonight's offering will be the family sitting before them. Turning toward his group, Jimmy declares that their charitable deed for the day will be the removal of the victim's skin. Spike visibly trembles at the announcement. Members of the gang pull masks over their faces and move toward the helpless captives. Hidden quietly in the attic above, the pregnant woman watches everything unfold, barely daring to breathe. Below, the gang begins the horrifying process, peeling away flesh while the victims struggle helplessly. Unable to endure the sight, Spike stumbles outside and vomits. Kelly soon follows him and bluntly tells him that avoiding reality won't help. Sooner or later, he would have to face things like this. Still shaken, Spike admits he cannot handle it. Seeing his distress, Kelly decides to stay beside him rather than force him back inside. As night settles, far away in the softly illuminated bone temple, Samson sits weakly beneath the moonlight while Dr. Ian rests beside him. Ian quietly explains that the medicine he has been using to calm Samson will run out in roughly 2 weeks. Over the past 28 years, he has gathered these supplies from distant places across the world, but now they are nearly gone. He sadly admits that the fragile peace they have shared cannot last forever. From his bag, Ian removes a syringe containing a lethal injection. He gently explains that it would allow Samson to pass peacefully, free from suffering. With heavy emotion, Ian prepares to say goodbye and raises the needle. But just as he is about to inject it, Samson softly speaks a single word. Moon. Ian freezes in shock, unable to believe what he just heard. The syringe lowers as realization overwhelms him. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Jimmy's group has finished their brutal work. All of the captives have been skinned except for the young man. Even the gang members appear exhausted from the violence. Jimmy approaches the remaining survivor and tells him he has a chance, but only one. He explains that a strong man must prove himself. The captive must choose one member of the group to fight. If he wins, he will take that person's place among them. If he loses, he dies. Refusing the challenge would also mean death. With no other option, the terrified man agrees. From the attic, the helpless pregnant woman watches, unable to intervene. The ropes binding the man are cut, and a knife is placed in his shaking hand. Jimmy orders him to select his opponent. After scanning the group nervously, he chooses Jimmia. She laughs at the decision, amused rather than threatened. The fight begins. The man lunges forward desperately, but Jimmia moves with ease, quickly stabbing him and knocking the knife from his grip. Though he manages to strike her across the face, she retaliates instantly, slicing his hand and forcing him to collapse. Smirking, Jimmia begins removing his trousers, mocking his earlier choice. Above them, the woman in hiding notices an iron hook lying nearby. Jamia climbs over the wounded man, taunting him. She tells him he picked her because he assumed she was the weakest, a mistake he would soon regret. Just as she prepares to start removing his skin, her body suddenly jerks. The iron hook crashes down onto her head. Everyone turns in shock as the pregnant woman reveals herself. Arrows are fired toward her, but she escapes as chaos erupts below. The wounded man crawls toward a gas cylinder, managing to ignite it. Flames burst outward, engulfing one of Jimmy's followers before the man himself is struck by an arrow. Outside, 2 gang members hear the screams and casually remark that the noise seems excessive. Moments later, the burning victim stumbles out of the farmhouse while fire spreads rapidly through the building. Seizing the moment, the woman leaps from the attic and runs once again. Furious, Jimmy orders Spike to chase after her. Spike sprints through the darkness, bow and arrows in hand. The woman reaches the settlement gate and struggles desperately to unlock it. Just as she nearly succeeds, Spike arrives behind her and raises his bow. Exhausted, she stops moving, accepting what seems inevitable. But Spike hesitates. Instead of firing, he quietly asks her to take him along when she escapes. The woman slowly walks toward him, then suddenly punches him hard in the stomach, grabs the lock, and escapes through the gate. Back at the farmhouse, the gang watches as the structure burns into ashes. Jimmy's frustration grows when Spike eventually returns alone. He immediately demands to know what happened. Nervously, Spike claims he killed the woman after she tried to flee. He explains that a struggle broke out and he shot her with an arrow. When Jimmy asks where the body is, Spike stammers that it was too dark in the woods and he lost track of the location. Jimmy scolds him, saying he should have cut off her face as proof. Overwhelmed, Spike begins crying and apologizing repeatedly. Jimmy coldly replies that the apology should be directed to Old Nick. Perhaps Old Nick would prefer Spike's face as compensation instead. One of the gang members steps forward eagerly, volunteering to carry out Old Nick's supposed will. He argues that Spike has proven himself weak and unworthy, especially after causing the death of Jimmy's best fighter. Before things escalate further, Kelly interrupts. She calmly says she agrees that Old Nick should decide, because she claims to have recently seen him. Jimmy initially dismisses her words, but Kelly continues describing what she witnessed: a strange man with orange-tinted skin living inside a massive temple built entirely from human bones, dancing peacefully beside an alpha infected. Her description finally captures everyone's attention. The following morning, Samson awakens near the temple and casually eats a grape left nearby. Inside his quarters, Dr. Ian works quietly, studying notes and continuing his research, deep in thought after the impossible moment he experienced the night before. Inside his quarters, Dr. Ray. Ian carefully gathers several bottles of medication, sorting through different pills with focused attention. Once finished, he steps outside carrying his dart blower, heading into the jungle to search for Samson once again. At the same time, Jimmy and his group stand atop a nearby ridge, observing Ian from a distance. After watching him closely for quite some time, Jimmy finally declares with certainty that the man below must indeed be Old Nick himself. Excitement spreads through the group as whispers and eager smiles follow the announcement. Jimmy remarks that it is unexpected to find Old Nick residing in what he calls a castle, noting that he appears somewhat different from how Jimmy imagined him. Kelly suggests they should all go down together and meet him immediately, but Jimmy raises a hand to stop her. He insists that he should approach first and speak privately before allowing the others to join. Meanwhile, Samson wanders through the jungle alone, fragments of past memories seemingly flashing through his mind. Nearby, Ian sits quietly when Jimmy suddenly approaches and sits beside him, catching the doctor slightly off guard. Jimmy studies him carefully before asking whether he is Old Nick. Confused, Ian admits he has no idea who that is. Jimmy quickly clarifies that he means Satan. Ian calmly explains that he is simply a doctor, and that the strange structure surrounding them is a memorial dedicated to the dead, something closer to a graveyard than a palace. Jimmy laughs at the explanation and curiously asks about Ian's orange-colored skin. Ian replies that it comes from iodine, which he applies to help protect himself from infection. Hearing the word virus surprises Jimmy, who dismissively labels Ian an atheist doctor. According to Jimmy, Old Nick unleashed divine punishment upon humanity, creating the ruined world they now live in. Ian realizes he is speaking with someone deeply devoted to Satanism, and Jimmy seems pleased that Ian understands his beliefs. He compliments Ian on constructing the massive bone temple, clearly impressed. Curious, Ian gently pushes the conversation further and asks whether Jimmy truly believes Satan is his father. Jimmy confidently agrees, but admits he knows little about him beyond the voice he claims speaks inside his head most of the time. He then suggests they sit together and talk a while. Up on the ridge, the rest of the group waits impatiently. One member keeps watch while two others casually spar nearby. Kelly sits carving her name into a tree trunk while Spike stands beside her. Spike quietly wonders what if the man below is nothing more than an ordinary old survivor, and that perhaps they should simply leave him alone. Kelly dismisses the idea, insisting that meeting old Nick would be something legendary. After a moment, however, she lowers her voice and asks Spike what she truly wants to know, whether Jimmy actually believes he is Satan's son. She noticed how Jimmy looked at the temple earlier, as though seeing it for the first time while pretending otherwise. Back below, Ian begins speaking about his past. He admits his memories are fragmented. He can barely recall what living in an organized society truly felt like, though he remembers that life once followed rules and structure that seemed impossible to break. There had been certainty back then. What he remembers most clearly is the church near his childhood home. His father served there as the vicar. Ian recalls believing that if his mother and sisters stayed inside the church, they would remain safe during the outbreak. But instead, his father led the infected straight to them, claiming that charity begins at home before offering his own family to the chaos outside. That moment, Ian says quietly, was the last time he ever saw his father. Jimmy then shifts the conversation back to the present, explaining that his followers believe Ian is old Nick and are expecting to meet him soon. Jimmy bluntly warns that Ian must cooperate with this illusion, otherwise Jimmy will personally tear him apart. Understanding the danger, Ian calmly agrees to play along. That night, Jimmy gathers everyone and announces that old Nick has agreed to grant them an audience the following day. He lays out strict rules. No one is allowed to touch old Nick unless they wish to be consumed by divine fire, and no one may speak directly to him except Jimmy himself, the chosen son. The group nods obediently. Elsewhere, Ian sits beside Samson once more. He confesses that he hasn't felt fear in many years, until now. The fear, he explains, comes from worrying about what might happen to Samson if Ian were no longer around. Ian shares a developing theory about the infection. Humanity already understands the physical changes caused by rapid cell growth, but Ian believes the disease also affects the mind. He has witnessed infected attacking even infants and small children, which suggests they may be reacting to hallucinations rather than reality. A medical professional, he explains, would describe this condition as psychosis, something that could potentially be treated. He gently offers Samson several tablets and encourages him to swallow them. Early the next morning, Spike quietly wakes before the others. Gathering his belongings, he attempts to slip away unnoticed. While moving through the jungle, an infected suddenly charges at him. After a frantic struggle, Spike manages to overpower it and finishes it off by driving an arrow into its body. Before he can recover, one of Jimmy's hostile followers ambushes him, pressing a knife against him. The attacker prepares to kill Spike, but Kelly suddenly intervenes, killing the man and saving Spike's life. She tells Spike that she has traveled everywhere with the group and insists there is nowhere safer than staying together, especially with her. Handing him the familiar wig again, she urges him to return with her. When they rejoin the others, Kelly informs Jimmy that the man tried to escape and they were forced to deal with him. Jimmy eyes her suspiciously, attempting to intimidate her into changing the story, but Kelly confidently repeats the same explanation. After a tense pause, Jimmy finally smiles, apparently satisfied. Meanwhile, Ian searches for Samson but cannot find him anywhere near the temple. Standing beside a stream, he washes his hands before noticing movement deeper in the jungle. Samson appears different now, more alert, more aware, as he walks steadily through the forest. Eventually, he arrives at the rusted remains of an abandoned train and climbs inside, sitting quietly among the empty seats. Fragments of memory begin returning to him. He recalls sitting on a train long ago, traveling somewhere unknown. A conductor approached and politely asked to see his ticket, only for the man's face to suddenly twist and transform into one of the infected. Snapped back into the present, Samson notices a lone infected lingering inside the train carriage. Within seconds, more begin flooding in from every direction. The compartment fills with snarling bodies, forcing him into a violent struggle. One after another, he battles through them, overpowering each attacker until the train finally falls silent again, littered with motionless corpses. Back at the Bone Temple, Dr. Ian prepares carefully for the approaching night. He searches through old belongings and finds music to play, setting the atmosphere for what he knows will be a dangerous performance. As darkness settles across the jungle, Ian moves around the temple, arranging decorations, lighting fires, and preparing the space like a ceremonial stage. By nightfall, Jimmy and his followers arrive, immediately struck by the eerie beauty of the illuminated structure. Flames flicker across towers of bones, casting long shadows that make the place feel almost sacred. Reaching the central chamber, they place masks over their faces and move deeper inside. A voice echoes through the pillars ahead. Music begins to play. From behind the towering columns, Ian emerges, fully committed to the role he has agreed to perform. Moving with exaggerated, almost supernatural motions, he begins a wild and theatrical dance. Flames ignite around the group, forming a blazing circle that traps their attention. At one moment, he throws a fine powder into the air, briefly blinding them as he continues spinning and moving to the rhythm of the music. The spectacle leaves them stunned. Meanwhile, Samson, still bloodied from his earlier fight, wanders away from the train after finishing off the last of the infected surrounding him. Caught up in excitement, Jimmy begins dancing along with Ian, soon joined by the rest of the group. The atmosphere turns strangely celebratory as Ian raises a burning staff, performing one final dazzling display that captivates everyone watching. When the performance ends, the group stands in awe. Ian motions for them to come closer. Speaking with authority, he tells them to kneel, but stops Jimmy specifically, addressing him instead as his son. Jimmy smiles proudly, thanking him for the grand display. Before leaving, Jimmy asks whether Old Nick has any wisdom or guidance to offer. Carefully choosing his words, Ian tells them they must continue their mission. Jimmy eagerly explains that their purpose is to cleanse the kingdom by brutally removing those he considers weak or useless. The statement clearly unsettles Ian, though he forces himself to agree. Masked Spike remains frozen in quiet horror. Jimmy presses Ian for more commandments. Ian continues, saying the children must always obey their leader. Jimmy enthusiastically repeats that obedience must come without hesitation or doubt. Then he asks for one final instruction. After a pause, Ian declares that Jimmy must continue expanding his followers endlessly. Jimmy cheers at the idea, proudly adding that he will keep growing his army until he rules the entire world. Satisfied, Jimmy prepares to leave and orders everyone to rise. But Ian suddenly stops them. His attention fixes on Spike. Asking him to remain, Ian walks forward and slowly removes Spike's mask. Recognition crosses Ian's face. Turning back to Jimmy, Ian announces that there is one final command yet to be given. Jimmy begins to object, but Ian interrupts, explaining that every god requires sacrifice. He reminds them of the ancient story in which a divine son had to suffer before ascension could occur. Kelly's expression slowly changes as she realizes where this is heading. Ian calmly declares that Jimmy, as the chosen son, must now fulfill the same role. To ascend, he says, Jimmy must be crucified, and his followers must carry out the act. Jimmy recoils in anger, shouting curses, but Kelly has already stepped forward with a knife. Realizing the deception, Jimmy suddenly laughs and claims they have all been tricked. He exposes Ian as nothing more than an ordinary man pretending to be Satan. If he truly were Satan, Jimmy argues, this wouldn't be possible. With that, he lunges forward and drives a blade into Ian's stomach. Spike rushes to help Ian, while confusion spreads among the remaining followers. Jimmy shouts that he alone is the true voice of Satan and orders them to kill Kelly. One attacker charges her but is quickly defeated. Another follows, and though reluctant, Kelly is forced to kill him as well. During the chaos, Spike turns on Jimmy, stabbing him. Kelly knocks Jimmy to the ground, ending his control over the situation. Spike kneels beside the wounded Ian, desperately trying to help him. Kelly realizes that Ian and Spike must have crossed paths before, and that Ian was never Old Nick. In truth, no such figure existed. Ian weakly smiles as Kelly admits he put on an impressive performance, though she knows the wound is fatal. Spike suggests Ian could have simply let them go earlier, avoiding all of this. Ian quietly explains that he saw Spike behind the mask and understood how much pain the boy had endured. Spike breaks down in tears. Kelly gently tells Spike there may still be something they can do. Follow Ian's final command and leave this life behind. Eventually, the two walk away from the temple together. Along the path, Kelly grows curious about Spike's real name and shares hers in return as they continue forward into the unknown. Behind them, Jimmy is nailed onto an inverted cross, screaming desperately for help. He cries that he can no longer hear his father's voice. His panic grows when Samson slowly approaches the scene. Ignoring Jimmy, Samson moves toward Ian's body. Kneeling beside him, Samson softly says, "Thank you." Ian's life fades away, and Samson gently carries his body into the jungle. Sometime later, far away on an isolated island settlement, life continues within a protected habitat. Inside a small home, a young girl studies history, reading about the Second World War. Her father, Jim, sits beside her, guiding her through the lesson and asking questions to help her understand. Suddenly, the girl asks him to stay quiet. She hears something outside. Jim listens carefully and soon hears it too. Both quickly grab their weapons and step outside. Moving through tall grasslands, they look down toward the distance where a massive swarm of infected races across the terrain. Ahead of the horde, two figures are running for their lives, Spike and Kelly. The girl asks whether they should help them. After only a brief moment of thought, Jim answers calmly, "Of course," and together they run toward the approaching survivors. Analysis. What if the apocalypse didn't end the world, but quietly reshaped humanity into something unrecognizable? For years, the Rage virus universe has terrified audiences with speed, chaos, and pure survival horror. But 28 years later, the Bone Temple takes a completely different path, and honestly, it might be the most disturbing chapter yet. Because this time, the question isn't how people survive the infected, it's what happens after surviving them for nearly 3 decades. Imagine a world where an entire generation has grown up without normal society. No governments, no cities, no memories of peace, only rules built from fear and beliefs created to make sense of endless loss. And deep inside this broken world lies something mysterious, a settlement known as the Bone Temple, a place where survivors don't just fight the apocalypse, they've learned to live with it. But here's the terrifying part. When humans finally stop running from horror, they sometimes start worshiping it. In today's video, we're diving deep into 28 years later, the Bone Temple, exploring its world, its story, hidden meanings, and why this film transforms the franchise from a survival nightmare into something far more psychological and unsettling. This isn't just another infected movie. This is a story about evolution, belief, and the frightening idea that humanity may adapt to darkness instead of defeating it. So if you think you know what to expect from this universe, think again. Let's step into the world 28 years later. Before we dive deeper into the story, let's first understand what 28 years later, the Bone Temple actually is. Because this movie isn't just a sequel, it's a major shift for the entire franchise. Set nearly 3 decades after the original Rage virus outbreak, the film drops us into a world that has moved far beyond the initial chaos. The cities that once collapsed are now silent ruins, nature has begun reclaiming civilization, and humanity survives only in isolated pockets scattered across dangerous territories. Unlike earlier entries that focused on immediate survival, this chapter explores life after adaptation, when surviving the apocalypse has become normal. Genre-wise, the movie blends multiple layers together. At its surface, it's still a post-apocalyptic horror film filled with tension and danger. But underneath that, it works as a survival thriller and a deeply psychological drama about rebuilding society in a broken world. The setting plays a huge role here. Most communities now live under strict protection, avoiding mainland regions still haunted by the infected. Venturing outside safe zones isn't just risky, it's almost forbidden. And that's where the story truly begins. A group of survivors hears rumors about something impossible. A settlement deep within infected territory where people supposedly live without fear. No constant attacks. No fortified walls. No desperate struggle for survival. This mysterious place is known as the Bone Temple. Naturally, curiosity turns into investigation. But what starts as exploration soon becomes something far more unsettling, because the people living there may have discovered a completely different way to exist in this new world. And once the characters step inside this society, they begin to realize that survival might come with a price far more disturbing than death itself. This overview sets the stage for a film that isn't just about escaping danger. It's about confronting what humanity becomes when the apocalypse lasts long enough to feel permanent. At first glance, 28 years later, The Bone Temple looks like another post-apocalyptic horror movie, abandoned landscapes, infected threats, and desperate survivors. But once the story unfolds, it becomes clear that this film is doing something much deeper. Yes, horror is still at its core. The danger, the tension, and the constant feeling that safety can disappear at any moment are all here. But this time, the real fear doesn't just come from the infected, it comes from people. The movie shifts the genre from simple survival horror into something closer to a psychological and dystopian drama. Instead of asking how do we escape, the film asks a far more uncomfortable question. What kind of world do humans build after living in fear for 28 years? One of the strongest themes running through the film is survival versus humanity. When civilization collapses, rules change, morality becomes flexible, and communities begin creating new belief systems just to cope with trauma. Another powerful theme is faith born from catastrophe. The Bone Temple itself represents how people try to give meaning to disaster, turning tragedy into ritual, fear into ideology, and survival into something almost spiritual. Emotionally, the tone of the movie is heavy, quiet, and unsettling. There are long moments where nothing explodes, nothing attacks, yet the tension keeps growing. You feel that something is wrong even before the danger appears. This makes the film especially appealing to viewers who enjoy intelligent horror, stories that stay in your mind long after the credits roll. So while fans expecting non-stop action may be surprised, audiences who appreciate layered storytelling will find something far more rewarding here. Because beneath the horror, The Bone Temple isn't just about monsters roaming the world. It's about how humanity slowly changes when fear becomes its new normal. Now let's step fully into the story, because 28 years later, The Bone Temple doesn't begin with chaos. It begins with survival that has almost become routine. Nearly 3 decades after the rage virus devastated civilization, humanity still exists, but barely. Small survivor communities live behind strict defenses, isolated from the mainland where infected zones remain dangerously active. For many people born after the outbreak, the old world is nothing more than a story. The film follows a scouting group sent beyond the safety of their protected settlement. Their mission is simple: explore abandoned territories, search for resources, and learn whether the outside world is finally changing. But during their journey, they hear whispers about something impossible. A community deep inside infected land, a place where people supposedly live without constant fear. This rumor leads them toward a mysterious settlement known as the Bone Temple. When they finally arrive, what they discover feels both miraculous and deeply unsettling. The inhabitants aren't struggling the way other survivors are. They appear calm, organized, almost peaceful. But something about the society feels wrong. Bones of the dead are preserved everywhere, displayed not as warnings but as sacred symbols. Rituals replace survival drills. And the people living there seem to believe the outbreak wasn't humanity's downfall, but its transformation. As the outsiders spend more time inside the temple, tension begins to rise. Questions emerge about how this settlement truly survives, surrounded by danger. Trust slowly breaks down. An ideological conflict starts growing between those who still fight the infected and those who believe resistance is meaningless. What begins as exploration turns into confrontation. And as hidden truths surface, the characters realize that the greatest threat may no longer be the infected outside the walls, but the choices humans make to feel safe in a world that never healed. From this point forward, the story accelerates toward a collision between survival, belief, and brutal reality, setting the stage for a powerful and unsettling climax. Now, let's talk about the ending, because the Bone Temple doesn't end with a simple victory or defeat. Instead, it leaves viewers with a question that's far more disturbing. Did humanity actually survive, or did it change into something else entirely? As the story reaches its climax, the truth behind the Bone Temple finally becomes clear. The settlement's survival was never based on stronger defenses or better weapons. Instead, its people built an entirely new philosophy around the apocalypse itself. Rather than fighting the infected world, they chose adaptation. The temple's rituals and beliefs were designed to remove fear, teaching followers to accept rage, death, and loss as natural parts of existence. In their eyes, the outbreak wasn't a tragedy, it was evolution. This ideological divide ultimately leads to chaos. Trust collapses, violence erupts, and the fragile balance that kept the settlement functioning begins to fall apart. The confrontation destroys the illusion of harmony the temple had maintained for years. Some survivors manage to escape, carrying with them a terrifying realization: the world isn't moving back toward civilization, it's moving forward into something unknown. The final moments of the film are intentionally quiet and ambiguous. Instead of offering closure, the movie hints that humanity may already be changing, socially, psychologically, and possibly even biologically after decades alongside the infected. The Bone Temple itself becomes symbolic. It represents humanity's attempt to make peace with horror rather than overcome it. And that's what makes the ending so powerful. There's no clear hero, no complete solution, and no guarantee that rebuilding the old world is even possible anymore. The film closes on an unsettling idea. Maybe the apocalypse didn't end humanity, maybe it simply began the next version of it. One of the most fascinating things about 28 years later, The Bone Temple, is that its real story isn't told only through dialogue or action, it's hidden in the details. The film quietly plants symbolism and visual clues throughout the entire runtime, and many of them completely change how you understand the world once you notice them. Let's start with the most obvious symbol, the bones, and that's where it separates itself from genre rivals. Most survival horror films ask, how do we defeat the threat? The Bone Temple asks, what if the threat changes us instead? This approach makes the movie feel more mature and reflective, though it may surprise viewers expecting traditional horror pacing. Some films emphasize action, others focus on emotional survival. But this installment leans heavily into world building, expanding the idea that an apocalypse isn't just an event, it's the beginning of a completely new civilization. So while comparisons are inevitable, 28 years later, The Bone Temple ultimately stands apart because it isn't trying to repeat what worked before, it's trying to redefine what an apocalypse story can become. When 28 years later, The Bone Temple finally reached audiences, the reaction was fascinatingly divided. And honestly, that might be exactly what the filmmakers expected. Many viewers walked into the movie expecting intense action, fast-paced horror, and the relentless survival energy that defined earlier entries in the franchise. But instead, they found a slower, more psychological story, one that spends just as much time asking questions as it does delivering scares. For some audiences, this was a bold and refreshing evolution. Fans praised the film for expanding the world in a meaningful way, exploring how humanity changes after decades of living in catastrophe. The atmosphere, world building, and philosophical tone stood out as major strengths, especially for viewers who appreciate thoughtful horror. Critics, in particular, responded positively to the movie's ambition. Many highlighted its willingness to take risks rather than simply repeat familiar formulas. Instead of playing safe, the film pushes the franchise into darker and more mature territory, but not everyone was convinced. Some viewers felt the pacing was slower than expected, arguing that the movie leans heavily into ideas and symbolism instead of constant tension or action. For audiences looking purely for adrenaline-driven horror, the shift in tone felt unexpected. And that's exactly why the film has become such a talking point. It sits in that rare category of movies that spark debate, the kind people argue about long after leaving the theater. Some call it a bold reinvention. Others see it as too different from what came before. Over time, films like this often gain stronger appreciation as audiences revisit them with new expectations. So the real question surrounding The Bone Temple isn't whether people agree on it, it's whether the movie dared to evolve when most sequels choose to stay comfortable. So after everything, the story, the symbolism, the world building, and that haunting ending, the big question remains, is 28 years later, The Bone Temple worth watching? The answer really depends on what you expect from it. One of the film's greatest strengths is its ambition. Instead of repeating the same survival formula, the movie pushes the franchise forward, exploring what happens when humanity lives inside an apocalypse long enough for it to become normal life. The atmosphere is deeply unsettling. The ideas are thought-provoking, and the world feels richer and more evolved than ever before. The tension doesn't always come from action. It comes from discomfort, from realization, and from watching characters confront a reality where rebuilding the old world may no longer be possible. But that same strength can also feel like a weakness for some viewers. The pacing is slower, more reflective, and heavily focused on themes rather than spectacle. If you're expecting non-stop infected attacks or traditional horror thrills, this film might surprise you, and not always in the way you expect. However, for audiences who enjoy intelligent horror, layered storytelling, and movies that stay in your mind after the credits roll, The Bone Temple offers something rare, a sequel that actually dares to evolve. This is a film for viewers who like to think about the apocalypse, not just survive it. So who should watch it? Fans of dark, atmospheric cinema, lovers of post-apocalyptic storytelling, and anyone curious to see how far this universe can grow beyond simple survival horror. In the end, 28 years later, The Bone Temple isn't just another chapter in the series. It feels like a warning, and maybe even a glimpse into what humanity becomes when the world doesn't end. It simply changes forever. Reviews. Serving as the next chapter after 28 years later, the story drops us straight back into a fractured world where survival has taken on stranger, darker meanings. Spike finds himself captured and absorbed into an unsettling cult-like faction known as the Blondies, a disturbing group operating under the theatrical authority of Sir Jimmy Crystal, played with chilling confidence by Jack O'Connell. Meanwhile, Dr. Tar Kelson, portrayed by Ralph Fiennes, becomes involved in the containment of the formidable Alpha known as Samson, adding another layer of tension to an already unstable landscape. Alex Garland returns to shape the narrative once again, clearly steering the saga toward what appears intended as the closing act of a long-running arc. A brief but notable appearance from Cillian Murphy connects the film back to its origins, reminding viewers of how far this universe has evolved. With Nia DaCosta stepping into the director's chair, the tone shifts noticeably. She leans into the odd psychology of the survivors and embraces the unsettling atmosphere, rather than overpowering it with stylistic excess. The film increasingly feels less focused on the infected themselves and more on the bizarre societies formed by those still alive territory that recalls later survival dramas where humanity becomes just as unpredictable as the outbreak. Ironically, this franchise explored those ideas long before many others popularized them. Watching the installments consecutively almost feels essential now, as each entry feeds directly into the next, building momentum toward an anticipated finale. Compared to its immediate predecessor, The Bone Temple feels far more controlled. Without Danny Boyle directing this time, the storytelling breathes more naturally, allowing the horror elements to settle in. DaCosta may not reinvent the genre, but she understands its rhythm, delivering a brutal mid-film sequence that ranks among the bleakest moments the series has produced. The narrative still unfolds in episodic fragments, yet thematic threads, science clashing with faith, shifting loyalties, cultural identity, and the nature of power, hold everything together more effectively. Jack O'Connell dominates whenever he appears, bringing menace and charisma in equal measure, while Ralph Fiennes is given material that allows him to explore a far more unusual character than expected. The ending lands with purpose, continuing directly from the previous installment while expanding the world first introduced decades ago when the outbreak began. There's even an evolved infected figure that feels like a quiet nod to Romero-era experimentation, suggesting that change, perhaps even intelligence, may not be impossible after all. The Alpha introduced earlier now suffers in ways that go beyond physical wounds, hinting at consequences tied to events longtime viewers already understand. And then there are the Jimmies, an idea that only truly clicks if you follow the earlier chapter closely. Violence arrives more directly this time, stripped of hesitation, reinforcing the film's underlying warning about history repeating itself when lessons are ignored. I'll admit I approached this sequel cautiously after finding 28 years later somewhat underwhelming, yet curiosity and a lifelong fascination with zombie cinema eventually pulled me back in. Garland's screenplay works better here, even if it still struggles to reach the heights of the earliest films in the series. The pacing can feel quiet at times across its runtime, occasionally drifting when momentum should build, and certain creative choices remain distracting rather than meaningful. Visually, the film holds its ground, and the performances remain solid across the cast, though the story surprisingly keeps the infected more in the background than expected. Religion plays a heavy role throughout, but beneath that lies a familiar idea, In a collapsing world, people themselves may become the greatest danger. DaCosta fills the screen with morally uncertain characters, reinforcing that survival rarely comes with clear answers, while Fiennes once again proves how adaptable he is as a performer. Shot alongside the next installment, the film continues immediately after the outbreak developments already established, following Spike now stranded on the mainland after being taken in by a faction known as the Fingers, under the magnetic yet unsettling leadership of Jimmy Crystal. After surviving a brutal initiation, Spike begins to understand the hierarchy within this strange new order, meeting figures like the compassionate Jimmy Inc. and the far more ruthless Jemima, while somewhere in isolation, the mysterious Dr. Toctor. Ian Kelson waits, and it quickly becomes clear that his role in all of this may change everything, just as the truth behind the cult begins to surface. Dr. Surface. Kelson continues his grim work within the Bone Temple, a disturbing sanctuary assembled from carefully cleaned human remains, arches of bones surrounding towering stacks of skulls that serve as both memorial and warning. Despite the horror of the place, it functions almost like a refuge, especially during the recurring visits from the alpha-infected known as Samson. Rather than violence, their encounters begin to resemble something closer to understanding. Kelson keeps the massive creature subdued with controlled doses of morphine, yet over time, Samson stops behaving like a predator altogether. Instead of attacking, the alpha lingers peacefully, slowly displaying signs that suggest fragments of humanity might still survive beneath the infection. He dresses himself, wanders into the wilderness searching for berries, and reacts with an awareness that unsettles Kelson as much as it fascinates him. When the doctor's supply of sedatives begins running dangerously low, he briefly considers ending Samson's life to prevent future catastrophe until the impossible happens. Samson speaks a single word: Moon. That moment convinces Kelson that the rage virus may not be irreversible after all. Elsewhere, the Fingers descend upon an isolated farm occupied by a small group of survivors, including Tom and his pregnant partner Kathy. What begins as a raid quickly devolves into ritualistic cruelty. Under Sir Jimmy's command, the gang transforms violence into ceremony, convinced their brutality serves Old Nick, the voice Jimmy believes belongs to his father, guiding him from beyond reason. Spike watches in growing horror as the survivors are subjected to unimaginable punishment meant as sacrifice rather than conquest. Unable to stomach what he witnesses, Spike withdraws, shaken, while Jimmy Inc., clearly beginning to question her leader's authority, shows him unexpected compassion. Sir Jimmy, ever theatrical, offers Tom survival through combat, promising membership if he wins a staged fight. The contest ends brutally when Jemima overwhelms him, though chaos erupts moments later as Kathy, hidden above the barn, strikes back and escapes into the night. Flames soon consume the farm after Tom's desperate retaliation, killing several members of the gang before costing him his own life. Furious and humiliated, Sir Jimmy orders Spike to track Kathy down, but when Spike finally reaches her, he pleads to escape alongside her instead. Distrusting his intentions, Kathy incapacitates him and disappears into the forest, leaving Spike to face the consequences of failure. With morale collapsing among the Fingers, Sir Jimmy turns his anger towards Spike, threatening execution. During a search through the woods, Ink spots the Bone Temple from afar and witnesses Kelson, his skin stained orange from iodine treatments, interacting calmly with Samson. Misinterpreting the scene, she becomes convinced the figure is Satan himself and proposes consulting him to decide Spike's fate. Sir Jimmy, eager to validate his beliefs, insists on confronting the supposed devil personally, unsettling Spike, who already knows the truth about the doctor. The meeting shatters Jimmy's expectations. Kelson is horrified to learn he is dealing with devoted Satanists, while Jimmy struggles with the realization that the man before him is merely human. Refusing to lose control over his followers, Jimmy forces Kelson into an impossible position: impersonate Satan or die maintaining reality. Tensions escalate the following morning when Spike attempts to slip away, only to be confronted by Jimmy Fox seeking revenge. Ink intervenes decisively, killing Fox and fabricating a story to preserve order within the group. Meanwhile, back at the temple, Kelson experiments further, administering antipsychotic treatments to Samson, theorizing that the infected rage may stem from extreme neurological breakdown rather than pure disease. Drawn by fragmented memory, Samson later wanders to the abandoned train where his infection began. For a brief moment, he relives a childhood interaction with a ticket inspector, an echo of the person he once was, before nearby infected suddenly attack him as though recognizing something different about him. That night, Kelson reluctantly performs the role forced upon him. Amid fire, music, and hallucinogenic smoke, he stages an elaborate spectacle meant to convince the fingers they stand before Satan himself. The performance restores Jimmy's authority over the gang until Kelson recognizes Spike among them and attempts to turn the situation, urging the followers to sacrifice Jimmy instead. Violence erupts instantly. Jimmy responds by mortally wounding Kelson, while Inc. fights desperately to protect Spike, cutting down those who remain loyal to Jimmy's rule. Spike retaliates, striking Sir Jimmy and bringing the confrontation to its breaking point. As Kelson lies dying, Spike stays beside him, while Inc. seals Jimmy's fate by nailing him to an inverted cross, ending his reign in the very symbolism he worshipped. Revealing her true name, Kelly, she leaves the burning remnants of the cult behind with Spike as dawn approaches. Samson arrives soon after, and in his fading consciousness, Sir Jimmy finally believes he sees the devil he sought all along. The Alpha gently acknowledges Kelson by name, offering gratitude before carrying the doctor's body away into the wilderness. Abandoned and helpless, Sir Jimmy remains crucified as infected figures close in around him. Far from the chaos, life continues quietly on another farm, where a young girl named Sam studies beside her father Jim. Spotting two exhausted survivors fleeing a pursuing horde, they rush forward to help, an encounter made more striking by Jim's familiar face, hinting that the larger story connecting past and present may finally be moving back into focus, just as unsettling implications about this world's untouched history begin to surface, suggesting that some monsters were never exposed before civilization collapsed, and what that means may be revealed sooner than anyone expects, although the infected still roam the shattered world. The film increasingly shifts its attention towards something far more disturbing: the cruelty people justify when society collapses. Beneath the bloodshed lies a sharp commentary on manufactured belief systems and the dangers of blind devotion. The cult surrounding Jimmy Crystal thrives not because of monsters outside their walls, but because fear itself has become their religion. Against that backdrop, the unforgettable sequence involving Kelson's theatrical deception, complete with roaring heavy metal spectacle, stands out as one of the boldest moments the franchise has attempted, blending absurdity, horror, and tension into something strangely mesmerizing. The violence remains intense and frequently excessive, yet the pacing rarely drags. Energy carries the film forward with confidence, making it difficult not to feel curious about where the story heads next. As a piece of post-apocalyptic horror, it leans heavily into risk-taking rather than familiarity, and that willingness alone makes it compelling viewing. For those skeptical after earlier entries, this installment feels like a redemption of sorts for director Nia DaCosta. Whatever criticisms followed her previous projects, here she demonstrates strong control over tone and atmosphere. Visually, the film is striking, balancing bleak wastelands with moments of unexpected beauty, while performances across the cast elevate even the strangest narrative turns. The story resumes immediately, with Spike trapped under the authority of Sir Jimmy Crystal and his unsettling collective of followers, the self-styled Jimmies who wander the ruins convinced they are carrying out divine punishment unleashed upon humanity. Spike survives largely by compliance, navigating the unpredictable moods of a leader who governs through intimidation and myth-making. At the same time, Kelson's quiet experiments with Samson unfold in stark contrast to the cult's brutality. Through carefully administered treatments, the Doctor manages to suppress flashes of rage within the Alpha, allowing glimpses of calm intelligence to emerge. Compassion and manipulation begin to form opposing forces within the narrative, one attempting restoration, the other thriving on fear. When the cult ultimately discovers the Bone Temple, their misunderstanding of Kelson as a supernatural figure pushes events into increasingly surreal territory. Despite several moments of graphic violence, the film's true interest lies less in shocking the audience and more in examining how power operates, how stories, prophecy, and violence can be used to control desperate people. In that sense, the real monster becomes unmistakably clear. Samson, slowly rediscovering fragments of humanity, feels almost tragic, while Jimmy Crystal's calculated cruelty exposes a far more recognizable evil. The film will likely divide viewers just as earlier chapters did. Anyone expecting straightforward zombie thrills may struggle with its eccentric detours and tonal swings, but those willing to embrace its stranger instincts may find immense enjoyment in its unpredictability. Scenes that might sound ridiculous on paper, Kelson dancing alongside a heavily sedated alpha or fully committing to his infernal performance, somehow work precisely because the film commits without hesitation. Another viewing perspective frames the story around Kelson's isolated research facility, where science continues stubbornly amid collapse. His unlikely connection with an infected subject contrasts sharply with a roaming cult devoted to ritualistic slaughter carried out in the name of a distorted saintly figure. When these two worlds collide, belief overtakes logic, and the consequences spiral quickly. Expectations going in may be modest, but the film frequently exceeds them through atmosphere and presentation. The cinematography captures both decay and scale, pairing intimate brutality with sweeping landscapes that emphasize how empty the world has become. Character writing remains surprisingly strong, particularly among younger survivors whose hardened outlook reflects a generation raised entirely within chaos. Their survival instincts are sharp, almost predatory, reinforcing how deeply the outbreak has reshaped human behavior. Combat sequences lean heavily into raw physical confrontation, especially knife encounters that feel painfully realistic compared to typical genre action. Practical effects enhance the brutality, with sound design amplifying every impact and cut. Torture scenes are tightly constructed rather than indulgent, while sudden shocks and a carefully chosen soundtrack maintain tension throughout. One late sequence involving Jimmy's long-awaited confrontation with what he believes to be a divine presence lands with remarkable confidence, pushing the film toward a finale that leaves an unexpectedly energized impression. In a franchise already known for refusing predictability, this chapter may be the most unconventional yet, and that deviation feels intentional. The infected remain present, but the filmmakers clearly find greater fascination in human psychology and moral collapse. Even characters with limited screen time leave distinct impressions, creating a world populated by flawed individuals rather than disposable victims. And among the newcomers, Jack O'Connell's presence stands out strongly, suggesting his character's impact may continue to echo long after the immediate conflict fades, especially as the surviving figures move forward into an uncertain future where the next chapter seems poised to shift the balance once again, just when it appears the story might finally settle. Another looming development hints that the real escalation hasn't even begun yet. I've been hearing plenty of praise surrounding Jack O'Connell's recent performances elsewhere, and after seeing him here, it's easy to understand why people keep mentioning his name. He brings a magnetic unpredictability that makes every scene feel slightly dangerous. Erin Kellyman continues proving her range as well, delivering a performance that feels completely different from her roles in major fantasy and franchise projects. Even compared to those already distinct characters, this one shows another side of her abilities. Ralph Fiennes delivering excellence is hardly surprising at this stage in his career, yet what stands out here is how much freedom he seems to have. Alongside the expected dramatic weight, he's allowed moments of humor and eccentricity that recall some of his more playful recent performances. The balance works remarkably well, giving emotional depth without losing the strange energy that defines the film. In fact, nearly everyone involved rises to the material, grounding even the most bizarre narrative choices. This installment may very well be the most graphically violent chapter in the entire 28 saga, yet it rarely feels excessive simply for shock value. Much of that restraint comes from Nia DaCosta's direction. Her visual instincts, already visible in earlier work, are refined here, combining striking imagery with clarity in storytelling. Despite the chaos unfolding on screen, the action remains easy to follow, something that greatly benefits a story this dense. Positioned as the fourth entry in the long-running franchise, The Bone Temple follows two parallel developments: Kelson's potentially world-changing discovery and Spike's uneasy integration into Jimmy Crystal's expanding faction on the mainland. Anticipation was high, especially knowing the production overlapped with its predecessor, and the result feels noticeably stronger. The film expands the mythology surrounding the infected while pushing the narrative into riskier thematic territory. Visually, the improvement is clear. Landscapes feel larger, compositions more deliberate, and several shots carry a haunting beauty that contrasts sharply with the brutality occurring within them. At this point, DaCosta firmly establishes herself as a filmmaker worth watching closely moving forward. The ensemble cast contributes heavily to that success, with standout work from Fiennes and O'Connell in particular. Seeing Fiennes occupy a morally hopeful role rather than a traditional antagonist adds refreshing dimension, while O'Connell fully commits to portraying a leader whose charisma makes his madness believable. The horror elements strike an effective balance between artistry and discomfort. Gore is present in abundance, yet often framed in ways that feel purposeful rather than gratuitous. Certain images linger long after they pass, almost like carefully composed still photographs hidden inside moments of chaos. And when the film finally reaches its closing stretch, the payoff lands strongly enough to generate genuine excitement for what comes next in the unfolding trilogy. At the same time, the experience leaves behind an unusual emotional aftertaste. Much like the previous chapter, the story can feel less like a traditional standalone film and more like a fragment of something larger. These newer entries resemble extended episodes within an ongoing narrative rather than self-contained blockbusters. The film wastes no time reintroducing its world or characters, assuming familiarity and pushing forward without hesitation. That approach creates an interesting contradiction. It functions independently in some respects, yet unmistakably operates as a middle installment. Tonally, it pivots sharply away from what came before, almost as if the earlier film quietly signaled this shift without fully preparing audiences for it. Some viewers might even describe it less as a direct sequel and more as an in-between chapter, bridging ideas rather than concluding them, and that lingering sense of incompleteness may actually be intentional, because just as the story seems to settle into its new direction, it hints that the real turning point for the entire saga is still waiting somewhere ahead, ready to redefine everything once again. The film almost functions like connective tissue, linking the opening chapter of this new trilogy with the heavily hinted final installment still waiting on the horizon. It feels less like a conventional sequel and more like an intermediary step, something designed to bridge ideas rather than resolve them. Ironically, the next film will likely resemble the continuation audiences originally expected when the return to this rage-ravaged universe was first announced, though if these recent entries are anything to judge by, it will probably avoid every predictable direction imaginable. Describing the overall experience isn't easy. The project itself feels paradoxical, as though it exists both to satisfy long-standing demands for another chapter while simultaneously challenging the very expectations that created those demands in the first place. Rather than delivering obvious nostalgia or familiar thrills, the filmmakers appear determined to subvert audience anticipation at nearly every turn. In a strange way, the film operates almost as anti-fan service, offering something adjacent to what viewers asked for while steering them toward ideas they may not have realized they wanted explored. That creative stubbornness is oddly admirable. Even when the direction taken doesn't fully align with personal expectations, it reinforces the sense that these sequels are being made without fear of disappointment or commercial safety nets. Few modern follow-ups feel this willing to be unconventional, prioritizing experimentation over comfort. Once again, the infected themselves take a secondary role. The true threat emerges from human cruelty embodied by Sir Jimmy Crystal, whose warped belief system transforms violence into supposed salvation. Convinced he is spreading a twisted form of charity across a ruined world, Jimmy governs through myth, fear, and theatrical brutality. While earlier appearances of his gang carried an almost absurd energy, their presence here becomes far more unsettling. The Jimmys move with disturbing enthusiasm, committing acts of savagery with childish excitement, laughing as though destruction were nothing more than a game. The film reinforces a recurring idea central to the franchise: humanity often proves more terrifying than the outbreak itself. Yet, it doesn't stop there. Running parallel to that darkness is another possibility, that people remain capable of compassion even after civilization collapses. That contrast is most visible through Dr. Kelson's storyline. Within the haunting beauty of the Bone Temple, an ossuary that doubles as both sanctuary and scientific workspace, Kelson forms an unexpectedly gentle connection with the alpha-infected he calls Samson. These quieter sequences slow the film down considerably, trading chaos for reflection. Instead of focusing on survival alone, they explore questions about the infection audiences may never have considered before. As new details about the virus emerge, long-held assumptions begin to shift. Moments that revisit ideas established decades earlier suddenly take on new meaning, making familiar concepts feel strangely fresh again. Some revelations land with surprising emotional weight, not through spectacle but through realization, suggesting evolution where none was once thought possible. Between the two narrative threads, Kelson's journey arguably carries the stronger emotional pull, though neither storyline leans heavily into traditional character development. Many arcs remain deliberately restrained, almost fragmentary, yet both paths remain engaging enough to sustain interest as they slowly move toward collision. When those storylines finally intersect, the payoff arrives in a manner consistent with the film's overall philosophy: direct, abrupt, and slightly unconventional. The climax may not explode with the scale some viewers might expect, but it ties events together with a blunt efficiency that feels intentional rather than incomplete. A handful of memorable set pieces punctuate the journey, though much of the film unfolds at a calmer pace than typical entries in the genre, occasionally bordering on quiet observation instead of relentless action. And yet, even in its slower stretches, the tension never truly disappears, because just beneath that calm lies the growing sense that everything unfolding here is merely preparation for something far larger, something waiting just beyond this chapter, ready to reshape the fate of everyone who managed to survive this far. In many ways, the film plays almost like a strange kind of hangout story. Though one half forces you to remain in the company of people you'd instinctively avoid at all costs, watching them commit acts you'd rather never witness, while the other half places you alongside a figure you never imagined sharing quiet space with, especially one capable of tearing someone apart moments earlier. Rather than constantly pushing viewers to the edge of their seats, the experience alternates between discomfort and curiosity, inviting you to observe a world that no longer follows recognizable emotional rules. It doesn't rely on traditional horror rhythms. Suspense, dread, and shock certainly appear, but they aren't deployed in the expected ways. Instead, the film feels oddly satisfying precisely because it resists easy categorization. Part of the difficulty in describing it comes from that lingering uncertainty. It's the kind of movie that leaves you unsure whether you admired it, resisted it, or somehow did both at once. Like the installment before it, the deliberate avoidance of expectation becomes both its greatest strength and its most frustrating quality. The choices that prevent it from delivering straightforward satisfaction are also the same ones that make it linger in your thoughts long afterward. Structurally, it's an unusual blockbuster, not because of extreme imagery or themes, but because of how quietly unconventional its pacing and atmosphere feel. Beneath the scale of the franchise lies something closer to an independent film, a hybrid blending horror, drama, and dark humor without committing fully to any single identity. The tonal shifts are especially striking. One moment plunges viewers into deeply unsettling brutality carried out by the Jimmy cult, while the next slows down into oddly peaceful scenes of Kelson and Samson simply existing together, sometimes in surreal calm brought on by chemical sedation. The contrast borders on absurd, yet that contradiction becomes part of the film's identity. It manages to feel disturbing and ridiculous, bleak yet faintly optimistic, unsettling while occasionally disarmingly funny. It's undeniably flawed and at times less gripping than it could have been, but many of those issues feel less like mistakes and more like creative decisions that won't resonate equally with everyone. There's something strangely captivating about the whole experience. It doesn't fully triumph, but it never collapses either, landing somewhere comfortably in between, propelled by unexpected narrative swings that keep it from feeling ordinary. Oddly enough, the fact that it doesn't completely win me over is part of what makes it memorable. The film commits so strongly to avoiding predictable storytelling that even moments where a safer choice might have worked better feel intentional. That refusal to conform gives the project an energy rarely seen in large franchise entries, leaving me hoping the studio commits to completing the trilogy. Even without knowing whether the final chapter will fully satisfy, curiosity alone makes it impossible not to want to see where it goes next, because it feels like there's still unfinished business with the Jimmys lingering just beyond the frame. Much like 28 years later, this chapter takes ambitious swings, some landing cleanly, others missing their mark. There's even an argument to be made that both films might have worked better as a single extended epic, experienced together as one continuous story, rather than separated installments. Viewed that way in the future, the pair could function almost like a two-part saga, each half strengthening the other. One noticeable weakness, however, lies with Spike himself. After serving as the emotional center previously, he becomes surprisingly passive here, drifting through events rather than driving them. Character growth takes a back seat while the narrative shifts focus toward Garland's fascination with the Jimmy cult and the increasingly compelling presence of Kelson. Fortunately, those elements remain engaging. The gang proves genuinely threatening, and Fiennes' performance continues to anchor many of the film's strongest moments. Expanding on ideas introduced earlier works in the film's favor, especially when revisiting some of the stranger concepts hinted at before. Yet despite several standout scenes, particularly one powerful moment near the end, the resolution leading into the final stretch carries an unexpected sense of abruptness. Instead of a climactic release, the story almost pauses, leaving behind a quiet reaction of, "That's it?" before pivoting toward setting up what comes next. The anticipation for the following chapter grows, though even that tease arrives in an unconventional, slightly anticlimactic fashion. It sometimes feels as though the filmmakers knew exactly where they wanted the next story to begin, but struggled to shape a definitive ending here. The central protagonist, once so vital, seems momentarily lost within the larger experiment unfolding around him. And yet, despite structural messiness and narrative loose ends, the film remains strangely gripping. Pieces don't always fit together cleanly, but the intensity and atmosphere keep pulling attention back in. What could have easily fallen apart instead becomes a chaotic, fascinating experience, one that works just enough to keep you invested, especially because the final moments suggest that everything seen so far might only be the calm before the series takes its most unexpected turn yet, even with some frustrations surrounding how the final stretch unfolds. The film still deserves recognition for attempting fresh ideas within a genre that often repeats itself. It experiments with familiar post-apocalyptic concepts rather than simply recycling them, and that willingness to explore new angles ultimately works in its favor, even when execution occasionally stumbles. Interestingly, the film lingers in memory long after viewing. Even weeks later, the emotional impression remains clear. Much like the previous installment, this chapter takes an unexpected tonal turn. After being rescued from the infected, Spike reluctantly earns his place among Jimmy Crystal's followers, forced to witness firsthand the devastation they leave behind. Rather than participating willingly, he exists as an uneasy observer trapped inside a system built on chaos and cruelty. Meanwhile, Dr. Kelson's research begins moving into riskier territory. Recognizing that Samson responds to familiar stimuli, the doctor pushes forward with experimental treatments, attempting to suppress or even reverse aspects of the infection through aggressive medical intervention. Where the earlier film leaned heavily into despair, this one introduces an unusual streak of dark humor, most evident in Kelson's eccentric daily life and his oddly touching interactions with the Alpha. Comedy emerges in strange places, often sitting uncomfortably beside brutality. The Jimmies occasionally appear absurd, yet that humor never fully masks the threat they represent. Violence always feels close, ready to erupt beneath the surface. As both storylines gradually converge, the narrative finds a rhythm that allows the contrasting tones to collide effectively during the later stages. Performance-wise, the cast continues to carry much of the film's weight. Alfie Williams has a quieter role this time, lacking the deeply personal connections that defined his earlier journey, while Jack O'Connell once again transforms his character into something uniquely unsettling rather than repeating familiar villain archetypes. Aaron Kellyman's character provides one of the few moral anchors within the gang, subtly questioning the actions everyone else accepts without hesitation. For many viewers, the film succeeds precisely because it dares to be different, leaving hope that the teased continuation will eventually materialize. Yet reactions remain sharply divided. Some audiences walk away energized by its unpredictability, while others feel blindsided by how drastically it shifts away from traditional zombie storytelling. Certain viewers even interpret parts of the film almost like a surreal rock opera detour, surprised by how prominently spectacle and performance elements appear within what they expected to be straightforward horror. The infected themselves often feel secondary, appearing only briefly while human conflict dominates the narrative. Religious symbolism and cult psychology drive much of the storytelling, transforming characters into exaggerated spiritual figures rather than typical survivors. For critics expecting relentless zombie action, this shift can feel disappointing. compared to the raw innovation of the earliest entry, which relied on experimental filmmaking techniques and stripped-down intensity. This chapter appears more conventional visually, despite strong makeup work and unsettling creature design. Questions linger about whether Kelson's discoveries truly change anything or merely set the stage for future developments. Still, the ending strongly implies another continuation, potentially bringing familiar faces back into central focus. Whether that promise revitalizes the franchise or simply prolongs it remains uncertain, especially for viewers who feel the series risks drifting too far from what originally made it groundbreaking. And yet, despite the complaints, curiosity persists, because even those frustrated by the direction can't quite ignore the possibility that the next installment might finally pull all these scattered threads together, just as Spike finds himself deeper than ever among Jimmy Crystal's followers. A group convinced that spreading their version of salvation across the wasteland is only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Rather than focusing their aggression on the infected, Jimmy Crystal's followers increasingly direct their violence toward other surviving humans. Jimmy himself justifies this shift through a warped personal history, claiming that witnessing his preacher father fall victim to the outbreak convinced him that the catastrophe was divine instruction rather than tragedy. In his mind, the world has already been claimed by darker forces, and his mission is simply to carry out their will. At the same time, Dr. Kelson continues working inside the Bone Temple, deepening his unusual bond with the Alpha-infected Samson. The creature now approaches him regularly, almost dependently, seeking the tranquilizing injections that temporarily quiet the rage within. What once appeared to be simple containment begins to resemble cooperation, hinting that Kelson may be edging closer to a medical breakthrough capable of changing humanity's understanding of the infection altogether. This fragile progress draws unwanted attention. One of Jimmy's followers notices Kelson's activities from afar and becomes convinced the doctor represents something far more significant to her leader's destiny. That realization ultimately pushes the two opposing worlds toward an inevitable confrontation, science and fanaticism preparing to collide. With Alex Garland once again shaping the screenplay and Nia DaCosta directing, the film manages an interesting balance. The lingering DNA of earlier installments remains visible, yet DaCosta adds her own stylistic polish, allowing the story to feel both connected to its roots and distinct from what came before. Her approach keeps the atmosphere grounded while embracing the franchise's increasingly strange evolution, further proving her capability behind the camera. Following directly after the previous chapter, Spike remains trapped within Jimmy Crystal's roaming faction, navigating a wasteland transformed by belief as much as infection. Meanwhile, Kelson pursues experimental treatments that appear surprisingly promising, occasionally punctuated by moments revealing the doctor's eccentric personality music drifting through the temple as he works, lending an oddly human warmth to an otherwise macabre environment. Despite arriving less than a year after the prior film revitalized the long-dormant series, this sequel takes a noticeably different direction. Interestingly, it offers less direct continuation than expected, choosing instead to expand sideways into new thematic territory rather than simply extending earlier plot lines. The performances remain a major strength. Ralph Fiennes delivers another layered portrayal, blending kindness, obsession, and humor, while Jack O'Connell fully embraces the theatrical menace of Jimmy Crystal, chewing through scenes with unsettling charisma. The cult itself, clearly inspired by disturbing real-world imagery, creates an atmosphere that swings between dark satire and genuine discomfort, occasionally pushing the violence into territory some viewers may find excessive. For longtime fans, the contrast with the franchise's original stripped-down intensity is impossible to ignore. The series has evolved into something stranger, more experimental, sometimes feeling far removed from the raw innovation that first defined it. That evolution raises an unavoidable question about whether the saga is building toward a meaningful conclusion or stretching its lifespan beyond necessity. Still, compared to the uneven reception of the previous installment, this chapter feels more confident about its identity. The storytelling is tighter, even if certain narrative threads quietly disappear along the way. Spike's journey, once central, now feels partially sidelined, a choice that may divide audiences expecting a more character-driven continuation. What ultimately sustains the film is the commanding presence of its leads. Fiennes and O'Connell anchor the chaos, grounding the increasingly unusual narrative turns and maintaining tension even when the story drifts into unexpected territory. Gore and unpredictability remain plentiful, though the infected themselves surprisingly occupy less screen time than anticipated, with atmosphere and psychological dread taking priority over traditional zombie spectacle. The closing moments deliver a sharp jolt of excitement, clearly positioning the next installment as the true destination of this evolving trilogy. While thrilling in isolation, that ending also reinforces the sense that this chapter primarily exists to prepare the stage rather than deliver final answers, a bold but risky move. Even so, the film stands as a confident, bloody, and ambitious entry that improves upon what came before, leaving audiences caught between satisfaction and anticipation, especially considering how unexpectedly early this release arrived, almost as if the filmmakers were eager to move pieces into place before unveiling whatever comes next, something that may finally reveal why all these paths have been converging in the first place. Going into this installment, expectations were fairly simple: expand the world introduced previously, and spend more time exploring the characters who seemed poised to become central moving forward. The subtitle alone suggested a deeper dive into Dr. Kelson's strange domain, along with further insight into the unsettling influence of Jimmy Crystal. Beyond that, approaching the film with minimal prior knowledge allowed the experience to unfold without heavy assumptions. The story resumes almost immediately after the previous chapter. Spike now finds himself surrounded by Jimmy Crystal and his followers during a brutal initiation ritual designed to determine who earns a place among the group. Jimmy claims divine lineage, insisting he is the son of Old Nick, another name he uses for Satan, and that his mission is to gather souls for his father. With only a limited number of disciples permitted within his inner circle, survival becomes a violent competition. Through a mix of luck and instinct, Spike manages to prevail and is reluctantly accepted into the gang, though Jimmy Inc. keeps a cautious but sympathetic eye on him from within the ranks. Running parallel to this storyline is Dr. Refor, Ian Kelson's increasingly unusual relationship with the alpha-infected Samson. After Samson is wounded during an attack on passing survivors, Kelson sedates him long enough to remove arrows and treat his injuries. What begins as medical necessity gradually turns into routine interaction. Both doctor and infected seem drawn to the calm created by sedation, forming an unlikely connection rooted in shared dependence. As supplies begin to dwindle, Kelson faces difficult decisions, yet his observations lead to a remarkable realization: the infection may not completely erase consciousness. Fragments of memory and identity appear to survive beneath the rage, raising questions about everything previously believed regarding the virus. Meanwhile, Jimmy Crystal's faction continues targeting survivor communities, spreading terror wherever they travel. During one excursion, Jimmy Inc. independently discovers Kelson and Samson together and becomes convinced the doctor might represent something spiritually significant to her leader. This discovery sets the stage for the inevitable collision between fanaticism and scientific curiosity, as both groups move toward confrontation driven by entirely different beliefs about the world. The narrative itself remains relatively straightforward, choosing character exploration over complicated plotting. Much of its strength comes from expanding Kelson's role and deepening his bond with Samson, while simultaneously revealing just how dangerous Jimmy Crystal and his followers truly are. Their earlier introduction carried an almost exaggerated edge, but here the humor fades into something darker, leaving only traces of unsettling irony beneath their cruelty. Interestingly, Spike shifts into a more observational role. Having previously served as the audience's guide to the mainland, he now struggles to reconcile his sheltered upbringing with the horrors unfolding around him. Exposure to the gang's escalating brutality forces him into rapid emotional maturity, highlighting the fear and confusion of someone still trying to understand a world far harsher than anything he previously knew. Alfie Williams handles this quieter transformation effectively, conveying discomfort without needing constant dialogue. Kelson's arc, however, remains the emotional centerpiece. Already established as eccentric through his bone-built sanctuary, he evolves further through his growing friendship with Samson. Under the influence of morphine-induced calm, glimpses into the Alpha's lingering memories suggest that humanity may persist even after infection, a concept reminiscent of earlier genre explorations, but given renewed emotional weight here. Both Ralph Fiennes and Chi Lewis Perry bring unexpected tenderness to scenes that could easily have leaned purely into horror. On the opposite side stands Jimmy Crystal and his followers, whose presentation shifts dramatically from their earlier appearance. Inspired by unsettling cultural imagery from the pre-collapse world, their aesthetic adds an uncomfortable layer of commentary, especially considering how figures once publicly celebrated could conceal darker truths. Many members of the gang grew up during the apocalypse itself, clinging to fragments of childhood media and exaggerated combat fantasies that now shape their violent identities. O'Connell fully commits to portraying a leader who is both charismatic and deeply unhinged, commanding loyalty through fear disguised as faith. Religion threads through nearly every aspect of Jimmy's worldview. Influenced by his upbringing under a religious father, he reshapes biblical language into something distorted, convincing his followers that the infected are possessed souls needing liberation. Even symbolic details, names, imagery, and ritualistic language reinforce this warped theology, contrasting sharply with Kelson's scientific pursuit of understanding. Performance-wise, the central ensemble continues to impress. Fiennes, O'Connell, and Williams anchor the film effectively, while Aaron Kellyman's character stands out as someone caught between loyalty and conscience, retaining empathy despite prolonged exposure to brutality. Lewis Perry's physical presence gives Samson both menace and vulnerability, allowing the character's gradual evolution to feel believable rather than gimmicky. As these intertwined paths continue drawing closer together, the tension builds not through spectacle alone, but through ideology. Belief versus evidence, control versus compassion, and it becomes increasingly clear that when these opposing forces finally collide, the outcome may reshape not only the survivors involved, but possibly the future of the infected themselves. Several supporting performers help flesh out Jimmy Crystal's unsettling inner circle, each contributing distinct personalities that reinforce the gang's chaotic identity. The actors portraying these followers fit comfortably within the group's disturbing dynamic, while even the performers behind the infected manage to give physical presence and menace where needed. Collectively, the ensemble strengthens the sense that this fractured society operates under its own warped logic. From a filmmaking perspective, the production effectively expands the already established world. The cinematography captures the untamed emptiness of mainland Britain, emphasizing how nature and decay have reclaimed spaces once defined by civilization. Wide compositions contrast sharply with intimate moments of brutality, while time-lapse imagery subtly reinforces the passage of time in a world that feels stuck between collapse and transformation. Particularly memorable are the dreamlike sequences shared between Kelson and Samson, moments shaped by chemical calm and lingering memory, alongside the harsher scenes depicting the gang's violent rituals. Sound design and music also play an important role in shaping atmosphere. Familiar musical callbacks blend with new compositions that enhance both tension and melancholy, while carefully chosen tracks add unexpected personality to Kelson's otherwise grim environment. The technical craftsmanship consistently supports the film's tonal shifts, allowing beauty and horror to coexist within the same frame. At its strongest, the film works as a dark, character-focused expansion of this universe. Rather than relying solely on large-scale survival horror, it leans into psychological conflict, examining morality, belief, and the ways people reshape faith during catastrophe. Through Kelson's compassion and Jimmy Crystal's fanaticism, the story introduces a new kind of threat that feels less about infection and more about ideology spreading through desperation. Yet reactions to the film remain sharply divided. For some viewers, this chapter represents a dramatic misstep, abandoning the grounded survival tension that once defined the franchise. Where earlier entries emphasized societal breakdown and raw immediacy, this installment ventures into symbolism, cult imagery, and provocative thematic territory that can feel disorienting. The reduced focus on the virus itself leaves certain audiences questioning whether the series has drifted too far from its origins. Creative decisions involving visual shock and unsettling imagery have proven particularly contentious. To critics, these moments risk distracting from narrative momentum rather than deepening it, creating an experience that feels intentionally uncomfortable without always clarifying its purpose. Religious symbolism, ritualistic violence, and exaggerated iconography layer together in ways that some interpret as ambitious experimentation, while others see only narrative excess struggling to find cohesion. Character engagement also becomes a point of debate. Spike's quieter presence and shifting priorities leave some viewers feeling emotionally distanced, especially compared to earlier installments where personal survival anchored the story more firmly. Without a clearly defined emotional center, portions of the film can feel adrift, caught between philosophical exploration and genre expectations. And yet, just as strongly, another perspective views The Bone Temple as the franchise's most compelling chapter since the original film. From this angle, its willingness to embrace darkness while still allowing space for hope becomes its defining strength. Ralph Fiennes' performance stands at the heart of that interpretation, presenting Kelson as a figure driven by empathy rather than fear, while his evolving bond with Samson introduces an unexpected emotional core rarely seen in stories about the infected. Jack O'Connell continues to command attention as a dangerously persuasive cult leader, and Alfie Williams maintains a grounded presence even with reduced focus. Nia DaCosta's direction deliberately avoids imitating earlier stylistic chaos, opting instead for steadier visual storytelling punctuated by moments of startling imagery. The cinematography reflects that restraint, balancing calm composition with bursts of energy when violence erupts. The musical landscape further reinforces the film's strange personality, pairing a haunting score with unexpected song choices that reveal surprising aspects of Kelson's character. Together, these elements create a sequel that feels both familiar and radically different, caught somewhere between horror spectacle and reflective character study. Whether seen as bold reinvention or frustrating deviation, one thing becomes clear: this installment refuses to play it safe. It challenges expectations, divides audiences, and leaves lingering questions about where the story is truly heading next, especially as the warning signs scattered throughout suggest that whatever follows may push this already unpredictable saga into territory no one is fully prepared for. Anyone who already found the franchise's recent return unusually experimental may want to approach this follow-up with caution. Picking up immediately after the divisive ending of the previous installment, the film wastes no time establishing that it has little interest in repeating familiar genre formulas. Rather than delivering a straightforward battle between survivors and infected, the story pushes deeper into uncomfortable territory, reshaping expectations of what a zombie or even horror film within this universe is supposed to look like. Spike, once positioned as the emotional center, steps further into the background this time. Instead, attention shifts toward three dominating figures: the volatile Sir Jimmy Crystal, the increasingly complex Dr. Kelson, and the imposing alpha-infected Samson. Together, they form a trio of characters pulled from opposite ends of humanity: fanaticism, compassion, and something suspended uneasily between monster and man. Traditional zombie action takes a noticeable backseat. Much of the horror emerges not from the infected roaming the countryside, but from the unpredictable violence carried out by human survivors themselves. Through Jimmy Crystal's faction, the film explores a version of post-collapse England shaped by ideology and chaos, while Kelson's evolving relationship with Samson quietly drives events toward consequences far larger than anyone initially realizes. Performance remains the film's strongest asset. Jack O'Connell throws himself fully into the role of Crystal, creating a figure both repellent and strangely vulnerable, a leader capable of cruelty yet still marked by recognizable human weakness. Opposite him, Ralph Fiennes delivers one of the most surprising turns of the series, taking Kelson into emotional and tonal spaces that range from tragic introspection to unexpectedly playful moments that briefly soften the surrounding darkness. Although the film may lack some of the visual experimentation that defined earlier entries, it still finds strength through atmosphere and character-driven tension. Combined with a haunting musical score that enhances the film's uneasy mood, the result is an installment destined to divide audiences, one that continues the franchise's tradition of challenging rather than comforting viewers. Whether embraced or rejected, the film undeniably carves out its own identity, suggesting that the creators remain more interested in reinvention than nostalgia. Much now depends on whether enough support exists to carry the story into its promised final chapter, one expected to bring the long-running saga full circle in unexpected ways. For viewers invested in the series, anticipation played a major role going in, especially after the previous film ended on such an unresolved note. The expectation of answers lingers throughout, though the film instead delivers another shift in focus. The infected once again remain largely in the background, while human conflict dominates the narrative, creating an experience that feels oddly familiar in structure despite its unusual tone. Spike's capture by the gang echoes classic stories of forced initiation, where survival depends on proving loyalty through violence. After earning his place, it quickly becomes clear that this group operates less like survivors and more like roaming executioners. Several sequences lean heavily into brutality, particularly an attack on a rural settlement that ranks among the film's most difficult moments to watch. Momentum builds considerably once the story reaches the Bone Temple itself, where Kelson and Samson's roles expand in ways that push the larger mythology forward. Without revealing too much, their involvement begins steering the narrative toward revelations that feel less like resolution and more like preparation for something still unfolding beyond this chapter. By the time the film reaches its closing stretch, curiosity replaces certainty. Questions linger about where the story ultimately plans to go and whether the rumored continuation will deliver the payoff audiences are waiting for. The future of the series may depend not only on creative ambition, but also on whether this daring, divisive entry finds enough support to justify the journey ahead, because the path forward now seems poised to lead into a confrontation that could finally determine what this world becomes after everything it has endured. The story closes on something resembling an intentional pause rather than a full stop, leaving events hanging just enough to make the possibility of another installment feel inevitable. Despite moments that lean heavily into brutality and discomfort, the film still comes across as an engaging continuation, especially for viewers already invested in the series' evolving direction. Interestingly, this chapter may feature fewer infected than any previous entry, yet that absence feels deliberate rather than accidental. Alex Garland's script often plays less like traditional horror and more like a psychological examination of what the idea of zombies represents. The pacing moves at a slower rhythm, but the narrative remains absorbing thanks largely to its character focus. Ralph Fiennes benefits most from this shift, with Dr. Kelson receiving significantly more attention and allowing the actor to deliver one of his most energetic and expressive performances in years. Nia DaCosta steps confidently into leadership of the franchise, demonstrating a strong visual command that distinguishes her work from Danny Boyle's earlier stylistic intensity. The transition to more conventional cinematic equipment gives the Bone Temple setting a sharper visual identity, emphasizing detailed framing, shadow-heavy night sequences, and intimate close-ups that highlight performance over spectacle. Chi Lewis Perry's expanded role as Samson adds unexpected emotional texture. The evolving dynamic between the Alpha and Kelson becomes one of the film's most compelling elements, strange, occasionally humorous, and surprisingly moving. Through these interactions, Garland's writing reveals Kelson not simply as an eccentric scientist, but as perhaps the story's most empathetic figure. Meanwhile, Sir Jimmy Crystal and his followers continue their violent journey across the wasteland, dragging Spike deeper into experiences that test his resilience and morality. Williams portrays this descent effectively, capturing the unease of someone forced to adapt too quickly to a world defined by cruelty. Although familiar faces from earlier chapters remain absent, subtle hints suggest they may still play a role in whatever comes next. For longtime fans, one of the most satisfying moments arrives through a brief but meaningful return that reconnects the film to its earliest roots, reinforcing the sense that the larger narrative is gradually circling back towards something bigger. The final act delivers emotional release while simultaneously opening new possibilities, leaving anticipation high for the already discussed continuation. DaCosta's approach prioritizes tension through character interaction rather than constant action. The chaos feels purposeful, lingering longer in memory even without relying on relentless spectacle. Carefully framed performances dominate the screen, allowing subtle emotional beats to carry weight alongside bursts of violence. Beneath everything lies a familiar theme resurfacing once again, the realization that humanity itself may remain the greatest danger long after the infected cease to be the primary threat. The return of familiar musical motifs toward the end adds an unexpected emotional surge, triggering nostalgia while reminding viewers how far this world has traveled since its origins. Moments like these reinforce why excitement for the next chapter continues to build. Still, not every reaction lands on the same side of enthusiasm. Some viewers entered with extremely high expectations following the previous installment and walked away feeling conflicted. While not considered outright bad, the film's storytelling and tonal choices may feel less cohesive to those hoping for a more traditional horror experience. Compared to its predecessor, the atmosphere shifts noticeably, trading intensity and fear for something quieter and more experimental. The reduced presence of the infected surprises many, especially those expecting a stronger focus on zombie horror. Though moments of gore and occasional jump scares remain, the overall sense of terror feels more restrained. Even elements like cinematography and musical tone divide opinion, with some audiences finding them mismatched with the story's darker ambitions. As a result, the film leaves behind a mixture of admiration and disappointment depending on what viewers hope to find. For some, it represents bold evolution. For others, a departure too far from the franchise's roots. Yet nearly everyone seems to agree on one thing. The future installment now carries enormous pressure to reconcile these differing directions, because whatever comes next will have to decide whether this strange and ambitious detour was setting up something extraordinary or merely delaying the moment the story finally delivers its ultimate payoff. Taken as a whole, The Bone Temple ultimately lands somewhere in the middle for many viewers. It's difficult to categorize strictly as a traditional zombie horror film, largely because the infected play a far smaller role than expected. The atmosphere and storytelling approach differ noticeably from earlier entries, creating an experience that may not align with what longtime fans anticipated. Still, despite unmet expectations in certain areas, it remains watchable and worth recommending, particularly to those already invested in the evolving saga. With Spike choosing to remain on the mainland, his survival quickly becomes a harsh coming-of-age ordeal. Forced into initiation within a roaming cult led by an increasingly unstable figure convinced demonic forces now rule the world, Spike is dragged deeper into violence he never chose. While the gang spreads destruction across the wasteland, Dr. Kelson continues his work within the ossuary, quietly pursuing discoveries that could reshape humanity's future. Because so little time has passed since the previous installment, the film launches directly into brutality and chaos familiar to the series. At times, the narrative feels stretched, lingering longer than necessary, yet the unsettling tone rarely fades. Much of that effectiveness comes from strong performances, particularly Jack O'Connell's volatile presence, which maintain tension even during slower passages. By the time events reach their closing stages, anticipation for what follows becomes one of the film's strongest driving forces. Across this shattered Britain, survivors confront not only violent factions, but also the unsettling evolution of the infected themselves. Faith, morality, and survival collide repeatedly, forcing characters to question what humanity truly means when civilization has collapsed beyond recognition. Rather than repeating earlier formulas, the story advances the franchise in a direction reminiscent of classic genre continuations that expanded themes instead of simply escalating danger. Performance remains a major highlight throughout. Ralph Fiennes anchors the emotional core with restrained intensity, while Alfie Williams portrays Spike's gradual loss of innocence amid exploitation and chaos. Jack O'Connell delivers a chilling antagonist whose unpredictability keeps every encounter uneasy, supported effectively by Aaron Kellyman and Chi Lewis Perry, both of whom help give depth to a world that might otherwise feel relentlessly bleak. Behind the camera, Nia DaCosta guides the film with confidence, maintaining continuity with earlier installments while shaping a more grounded visual identity. Sean Bobbitt's cinematography emphasizes realism through textured locations and raw framing, allowing violence to feel immediate rather than stylized. Practical effects and carefully staged gore enhance the sense of authenticity, reinforcing how fragile survival has become. Music and sound design further strengthen the atmosphere. Hildur Gudnadottir's score provides a somber backbone, while carefully placed musical choices inject unexpected personality into key moments. Subtle musical callbacks reconnect the film to its origins, creating emotional resonance that bridges past and present entries within the franchise. Even without returning to earlier settings, the story retains emotional weight through character focus and thematic exploration. The film quietly explores how social divisions and belief systems evolve under extreme pressure. an angle rarely examined in depth within zombie stories. Alfie Williams once again proves compelling as Spike, maintaining audience investment even as the character is pushed into increasingly disturbing situations. Watching his progression remains one of the film's strongest elements. Once a sheltered child unfamiliar with the harsh realities beyond his isolated home, Spike now faces moral trials that force him to confront the darkest aspects of humanity. His induction into the Jimmies exposes him to cruelty on a scale he has never experienced, testing the compassion that previously defined him. Williams handles these emotional shifts convincingly, allowing Spike's internal struggle to feel authentic rather than exaggerated. Opposite him, Jack O'Connell delivers a deeply unsettling performance as Jimmy Crystal, the cult's volatile leader. Crystal's authority rests on fear, myth-making, and distorted admiration for figures from the old world, creating a chilling contradiction between public image and hidden brutality. The character's warped worldview reflects a society frozen at the moment of collapse, where truth never fully surfaced and legends replaced reality. This detail adds an unsettling layer to the cult's ideology, reinforcing how ignorance and belief can become weapons in a fractured world. Yet the emotional centerpiece remains Ralph Fiennes as Dr. Kelson. The sequel finally expands on the motivations only hinted at before, revealing a man who refuses to abandon hope despite decades of devastation. Living among remains meant to honor the dead rather than fear them, Kelson represents a rare form of optimism within the apocalypse. His attempts to communicate with and rehabilitate the Alpha-infected Samson suggest that humanity may not be entirely lost, even within those transformed by the rage virus. Fiennes approaches the role with remarkable balance, blending vulnerability, intellect, and quiet determination. The evolving relationship between Doctor and infected becomes one of the film's most thought-provoking ideas, hinting that understanding, not violence, might ultimately shape the future of this world. By reconnecting more directly with earlier entries, the film moves away from the anthology-like feelings some previously associated with the series. Instead, it reinforces that these stories are now part of a larger, interconnected saga. Familiar threads resurface, rewarding longtime viewers while making it clear that knowledge of past installments enriches the experience significantly. And as the story closes, the lingering promise of future chapters becomes impossible to ignore, suggesting that this devastated world still holds countless stories waiting to unfold. Final conclusion. 28 years later, the Bone Temple ultimately stands as one of the most divisive yet fascinating entries in the franchise. Rather than delivering a conventional zombie spectacle, it deliberately shifts focus toward humanity itself, its beliefs, cruelty, resilience, and fragile hope in the aftermath of collapse. The infected remain important, but the true horror increasingly lies in how people reshape meaning, faith, and power when the old world disappears. Nia DaCosta's direction steers the series into stranger, more character-driven territory, trading relentless action for atmosphere, philosophy, and unsettling experimentation. Alex Garland's screenplay expands the mythology while challenging expectations, creating a film that often feels less like a traditional sequel and more like a bold middle movement in a much larger narrative. The performances anchor everything. Ralph Fiennes delivers a standout portrayal filled with empathy and eccentric brilliance. Jack O'Connell crafts one of the franchise's most disturbing antagonists, and Alfie Williams continues to ground the chaos with emotional sincerity. Together, they transform what could have been a transitional chapter into something memorable, even when uneven pacing or unresolved threads reveal its role as a bridge toward the finale. For some viewers, the reduced focus on zombies and heavier emphasis on ideology and character will feel like a departure too far. For others, that very risk-taking is what keeps the series alive decades after its beginning. Either way, the Bone Temple refuses to repeat itself, choosing evolution over nostalgia. In the end, the film succeeds not because it provides answers, but because it expands possibilities. It leaves audiences unsettled, curious, and debating what the franchise has become, and more importantly, what it might still become next. If the upcoming chapter delivers on the groundwork laid here, this installment may eventually be remembered as the moment the series transformed from survival horror into something far more ambitious, a haunting exploration of humanity after the end of the world.